Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's video is part one of a two-part series dedicated to the GT BMX race and freestyle hubs. Part one will focus on the race hubs and their generations, and part two will get into the Superlace. So let's get started. All the racing or GT BMX hubs, they're not staggered like the Superlace, and GT referred to them in the beginning as small flange, and then race hubs, sometimes standard hubs, and then later on simply low flange hubs. They were primarily used on GT racing bikes, like the Pro Series T model, the Pro Series. They could also be found on Robinson racing bikes and some power lights as well. And since dyno came into the late scene for racing, and they were owned by GT, you can bet that some of the dyno models also came with the GT race hubs. Let me know what you had back in the day in the comments section. So race lace. Where did this term come from? Many people refer to the GT racing hubs as race lace and the GT high flange freestyle hubs as Superlace. And the reality is Superlace hubs from the 1980s and 1990s are always staggered spoke hole and always high flange design. GT used the name Superlace to refer to their freestyle hubs, and in fact, they continue to use that Superlace nomenclature for their new school hubs you find on their current production bikes. And one could argue that those are not Superlace because the spoke holes are not staggered, but that's for another video and for another day. So the race hubs picked up the slang terminology race lace to differentiate those hubs from the freestyle versions. Let's just be clear, there is no such thing as a GT race lace hub. In fact, the credit of the original Superlace design of the GT hubs once again is owed to Brian Skura, who also invented the Odyssey Gyro. SST came up with the race lace terminology as early as 1985, well before the GT Superlace hubs came out. Brian also rode for GT in 1986, so I'm sure there was a deal made. Here's proof, courtesy of a BMX magazine ad. This is Greg Hill from GT using the SST hubs. And you'll see that he referred to them as race lace, and that's the Superlace pattern. So that's interesting. I know your mind is blown, right? So moving forward, there's a general criteria for which the generation of the hubs are defined and accepted. Now, this criteria is based on our view as BMX owners and members of the community. It is not something that GT refers to on any of their paperwork or any other boxing or packaging or media, nothing like that. So there are basically 4 rules to changing a generation. And this is what's generally accepted in the community. So let's get into rule number 1. A different hub shape or body shape or length indicates a different generation. Rule number 2, different locking collars or jam nuts indicate a generation change. Now, this is not always true through some of the generations because they offered both sealed bearing and both sealed mechanism. That's loose ball for the rest of us, and no locking collars. So there's that debate. Rule number 3, previous and current generations can both be available during a transition period, meaning you could still have some older hubs that are being sold at local bike shops that end up crossing over into the new generation hubs when they're available. There's nothing new there. And then rule number 4, new GT logo decals and original decals, I'm not talking about something somebody puts on afterwards, represent a change. Now, this is where things get very confusing. So there's a lot to unpack here. Within the very early stages of design, there were revisions and variations. And these variants, for the sake of continuity and not breaking the hub generation law that some of us have come to know, we'll refer to this as Generation 0 and then Generation 1. So let's take a look at this photo courtesy of member Blue78 on the BMX Museum, who did a wonderful job of indicating the changes between the Generation 0 and the Generation 1 hub. And we show here in the photo Generation 1 and the alternate Generation 1. And that's what we're referring to. So you can clearly see that the shoulder or landing area where the Freewheel threads are a lot closer on the Generation 0 to the flange than they are on what we all think is Generation 1. So that's interesting. So let's dive into this a little bit. So starting with Generation 0, these were available as early as 1983, and they went to about 1984. They are all chrome plated. Cost would be about $55 back in the day. They're 36 hole only sealed bearing cartridges, and they had hollow chromoly axles. They were all flip-flop design, meaning the threads were on both sides of the hub for the Freewheel. They had the split collars that we've all come to know. The first generation GT bubble font logo for the decal with red letters and blue and yellow stripes. The hub diameter at the hourglass center was the thickest, Generation 0 and 1. These were measuring 22 millimeter, and they supposedly have some variants of this in the machining, and what you see in the picture, some of the machining features, like the grooves, they were more rounded, if you will, and the Generation 1 was more defined. They were more proud. So there's a little bit of a difference there, so you can see. And again, this just comes down to probably prototyping into the very first production run, and then realizing they needed to make some changes, and then letting it rip. So that's pretty much what we think is going on here. And again, this was probably done on manual lathes, a tracer lathe. I don't think there was CNC at this point. There could have been, I might be wrong, but I don't know what their production facility was like then. So we're going to say that once they got that down, their newest revision, and they let it rip, that became Generation 1, and that's it. So, these, like I said, the biggest indicator of Generation 0 is that the Freewheel threads are really close to the flange. So that's the dead giveaway. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Generation 1. And so Generation 1 was available from 1983 to deep late 1987. These came chrome-plated, white, or black. The advertisement that you're going to see states blue as a color, but nobody's ever seen an OG blue Gen 0 or Gen 1 hub. And the box doesn't show blue for a color option either. So we're going to rule that out. In 1983-84, these would have cost you about $55. The holes are all 36 hole. The bearings are sealed cartridge. The axles were all hollow chromoly. They were flip-flop only. And they're split collar, again, for the locking collars. This also was 22 millimeter at the hub center diameter. And the biggest giveaway, so we can identify them, is there's more landing right next to the flange diameter to allow the Freewheel to be pushed, further away. And again, that Generation 0 had that so close to the flange, it would have probably interfered with the spokes, and they probably made that change for that reason. So after we look at that, we move on to Generation 2. And Generation 2 was available from 1988 through 1990. This was a short generation run. And if you look at the 1987 GT BMX catalog, you'll see that Generation 1 hubs are mounted on the Pro Series bike. 1988 GT BMX catalog also shows the Generation 1 race hubs in photos. And since this catalog was made in 1987, it's safe to say that the crossover period was in late 87 into 1988. These came chrome-plated, white, or black. About $60 it would have cost you back in the day in 1988. These are 36 hole or 32 hole. That has changed now. Sealed cartridge or sealed mechanism, so that's loose ball. And the they would have been flip-flop or non-flip-flop. So there's some generation 2 that had the threading on one side only or both sides. So there's a change to that design. These were hollow chromoly axles and the split collars again. The decal is similar to Gen 0, Gen 1. It's a little bit narrower, but it still has that bubble font logo, the red letters, and the blue and yellow stripes. The hub diameter is the giveaway. So the hourglass section, the narrowest section, is now 19 millimeter versus 22 millimeter for the previous. So that's the indicator that you have a Gen 2 based on that criteria. So moving forward, Generation 3. These were first available in 1990, and they were used through about 1994. Chrome plate was available, black or white, although the majority of the hubs at this point were all chrome plated. In 1993, these are going to cost you about 60 bucks. They came 36 hole or 32 hole, sealed cartridge or sealed mechanism. Now the axles are all solid, no more hollow, and they're still chromoly. They were flip-flop design and non-flip-flop. They were split collars or jam nuts, depending on how the bearings were set up. The logo for the decal is different now. So now we have a 1990 GT logo on the decal, slightly different font. These are thinner, like Generation 2, towards the center of the hub. And there are some variations of the design of Generation 3. And we believe this is because production was moved from one facility to another. So some people to get them with like acorn style nuts on the end. Some people have them with standard nuts. It's just, you know, odd. So there are some variations in there. Okay, so now we move forward to Generation 4. And these were available from 1994 through about 1996. These only came in chrome plate. 60 bucks in 1994 would have been the cost to buy them. They came 36 hole or 32 hole. They were sealed cartridge or sealed mechanism, although the majority of this generation were all found to be sealed mechanism. Solid chromoly axles. They were flip-flop design and non-flip-flop. Now, the majority of the ones that I've seen have been non-flip-flop, meaning they're only threaded on the one side. But I've been told that there are versions, but I have not seen them, so I have to go by what I'm being told. If you guys know or you have a Generation 4 that you know has you know, flip-flop, put it down in the comment section. We'd love to look at that. So the biggest change here for Generation 4, and it's the most noticeable indicator, is that this is the thinnest hourglass hub of all of the generations. So this one clocks in at 18 millimeters at the smallest section. That's the rear hub. The front hub is even smaller at 16 millimeter. So this makes Generation 4 the thinnest of all the generations. So again, this towards the end of 1996, these were phased out. And around 1994, GT started to introduce their Mohawk design hubs for their freestyle and for their racing. So GT started switching over to the Mohawks. They were 32 hole and 36 hole. And on their high flange side for their freestyle, they were 36 or 48 hole. So, you know, that's pretty much the run from 1983 to 1996 of the GT hubs. So a lot of effort and a lot of research went into gathering all this information. So there was countless hours scouring through BMX Plus, BMX Action, you know, American Freestyler, Go, Freestyle magazines, looking at ads, looking at articles, a lot of, you know, being on the forums, the BMX Museum, and debating the subject, the BMX Society, you know, Googling the stuff. So there's a lot of information that was gathered and brought in. So I think that this is probably the most accurate representation of what we understand to be the generation of the race hubs. Of course, you're more than welcome to debate. That's why we're here. So you can put them down in the comment section. Tell me about what you guys had back in the day, what kind of bikes you had, was on your Robinson, whatever. I mean, I love reading that stuff. So, you know, hit me up with what you think is going on here. If you agree, you disagree. But that pretty much wraps it up. So, you know, part two, we're going to be working on the Superlace hubs and their generations and all their intricacies. So hope you liked the video. Hope you learned something new today. Hit the subscribe and like the video. I'd like to see more of you guys watching this stuff. So stay tuned for more. All right, have a great day.